I asked him, "Did you ever love me?" He lay on his deathbed, silent. After 60 years of a forced marriage, I already knew the answer. As he took his last breath, he whispered, "If I could do it again, I'd never meet you." Then, everything went dark. When I opened my eyes, I was back in my high school classroom. Reborn, and the first person I saw was him. I was reborn in my senior year of high school. The moment I opened my eyes, I found myself sitting at my old wooden desk, surrounded by the familiar faces of my classmates. The teacher's voice echoed in the background, calling attendance. My fingers clenched the edges of my desk as reality set in. This was real. I was back. In my past life, I had lived 60 years bound to a man I never loved. Juan, a forced marriage dictated by our families. One that turned into a lifetime of regret. He was ruthless, arrogant, and selfish. My opinions, my dreams, my happiness, none of it mattered to him. I was just a woman he married because it was expected of him. Juan never cared about me. He controlled everything, my time, my decisions, my freedom. At first, I tried to make things work. I thought, if I did everything right, if I stayed patient, maybe he would change. But no matter what I did, his heart remained locked away. I was his wife in name only. For 60 years, I was trapped in that marriage. I managed his business, kept his household running, raised his children, and sacrificed my youth for his ambitions. On the outside, we were the perfect couple. On the inside, we were strangers living under the same roof. He never mistreated me, but he never loved me either. That cold distance, that quiet indifference, it was worse than any cruelty. Even on his deathbed, as he lay weak and frail, he asked me one final question. "Did you ever love me?" I stood by his bedside, staring at the man who had dictated my entire life. I thought about all the years I had wasted on him, all the times I had longed for even the smallest sign of affection. I remained silent, and then, I heard his final words. "If I could live again, I would set you free. I would never meet you." The next thing I knew, I was here. Back in high school, I took a slow, shaky breath, trying to steady myself. This was my chance. This time, I wouldn't let my life be controlled by someone else. I would make my own choices, follow my own path. I would never let Juan Carter trap me again. But the moment I made that promise to myself, the classroom door swung open, and he walked in. Juan Carter, 18 years old, stood at the entrance of the classroom. His sharp eyes scanned the room, his posture exuding confidence and arrogance. The same way he always had. Nothing had changed. My chest tightened as memories of our past life flooded in. The fights, the loneliness, the regret. But this time, I refused to let the past repeat itself. His gaze swept across the room and landed on me. For a moment, his expression flickered. Confusion, recognition, I couldn't tell, but I wasn't going to wait to find out. I turned away. The teacher gestured for him to take his seat. I felt his presence moving closer, but I kept my eyes locked on my notebook, pretending not to notice. I wouldn't give him the satisfaction of acknowledging him. Juan Carter, the teacher called his name. "Transfer student, you'll be sitting there, no. The empty seat beside me, no. Juan strolled over and pulled out the chair next to mine. I felt the air shift as he sat down, his presence heavy beside me. The past was suffocating me, wrapping around my throat like chains. I thought I had escaped. I wouldn't do this again. I refused. I kept my eyes forward, ignoring him completely. But Juan had never been the type to be ignored. After a few minutes of silence, he leaned closer, his voice low. "Have we met before?" I gripped my pen tighter, my knuckles turning white. I wouldn't respond. I wouldn't let him pull me into his orbit again. When I didn't answer, he chuckled under his breath. "You don't talk much, do you?" I focused on my notebook, forcing myself to remain unaffected. Juan leaned back in his chair, drumming his fingers against the desk. "Strange," he murmured. "You feel familiar." My heart pounded against my ribs, but I refused to let him see any reaction. This wasn't the same lifetime. I was no longer his wife. I was just a high school student, and I would never let him get close to me again. The bell rang, signaling the end of class. I gathered my things quickly, determined to get away from him. But as I stood up, he spoke again. "Hey." I froze. "Why do I feel like I've seen you before?" I clenched my jaw, keeping my back turned. Then, without a word, I walked out of the classroom. Carter might have been my husband in another life, but in this one, he was nothing to me. And I would make sure it stayed that way. Avoiding Juan was supposed to be easy. I knew everything about him, his habits, his personality, his weaknesses. In my past life, I spent 60 years by his side, watching him build his empire, while I stood in the shadows, but no matter how much I tried to stay away, he kept showing up. It started with small things. He would glance at me in class, his eyes lingering a little too long. He would casually ask me questions, testing if I would respond. But I never did. Then, he started getting bold. One afternoon, as I packed my books, he suddenly spoke. "You don't like me, do you?" I stiffened. I kept my gaze locked on my notebook, ignoring him. Juan let out a short laugh, his tone amused. "It's funny. I feel like we've known each other for years, but you act like I don't exist," I gritted. My teeth. We did know each other for years, 60 of them, and they were miserable. When I didn't answer, he leaned closer. "Did I do something to you?" "Yes. You stole my life. You forced me into a marriage I never wanted. You controlled my world and never gave me a choice." But he didn't remember any of it, and I wasn't going to waste my new life explaining it to him. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the classroom without another word, but Juan was persistent. The next day, as I walked through the school hallway, I overheard something that stopped me in my tracks. "You know Juan's engaged, right?" I turned my head sharply. A group of girls were whispering near the lockers, giggling. "His family already picked her for him," one girl said. "Some rich girl. He's probably going to marry her after graduation." My hands curled into fists. I already knew that. In my past life, that rich girl was me. I was the chosen for him. And yet, Juan never treated me like one. He had other women. He never brought them home, never disrespected me publicly. But I knew. I had seen the late-night calls, the hidden messages, the expensive gifts that weren't for me. And the worst part? I never confronted him. I had been so desperate to make our marriage work, to convince myself that one day, he would love me. I endured it, not this time. I refused to be that pathetic girl again. That evening, my father called me. His voice was stern, businesslike. "We're having dinner with the Carter family this weekend. Be ready." I gripped the phone. No silence. Then, a slow sigh. "Don't be foolish. This marriage is important for our family." I had heard those words before. In my past life, I obeyed. I went to that dinner, smiled when I was supposed to, and sealed my fate with a handshake. But now, I wasn't their puppet anymore. "I don't care about the Carter family," I said firmly. "I'm not marrying Juan. You don't have a choice." "Yes, I do." I hung up. But deep down, I knew it wouldn't be that simple. My parents wouldn't give up that easily, and I was right. The very next morning, I walked into the classroom to find Juan standing in front of my desk. His expression was unreadable. "So, you don't want to marry me?" I froze, they told him. He watched me carefully, as if he was studying my every reaction. "Your father said you refused our engagement." I met his gaze, forcing myself to stay calm. "That's right." A flicker of something crossed his face. "Why?" I let out a dry laugh. "Because I don't want to spend my life with someone who doesn't love me." His jaw tightened. "You don't know how I feel." "Yes, I do," I shot back. "I've always known. Juan had never once loved me in my past life. And if he didn't love me after 60 years, why would he care now?" I turned away, ready to end this conversation. But then, his next words stopped me cold. "What if I told you I do love you?" My breath caught. I turned back to him, searching his face for any sign of sincerity. But this was Juan. He was a businessman. He never said anything without a reason. Narrowed my eyes. "You're lying." His gaze darkened. Am I? We stared at each other in tense silence. I knew Juan well enough to recognize a game when I saw one. If I fell for this, if I let him pull me in again, I'd be right back where I started. Refused to let that happen. So I forced myself to say the words I knew would end this once and for all. I don't love you, Juan. For the first time since I was reborn, I saw his expression falter. For the first time, Juan looked hurt, but I didn't wait for him to respond. I grabbed my bag and walked out of the classroom. I had made my choice. I would never let Juan ruin my life again. Avoiding Juan was proving to be harder than I expected. Everywhere I went, he was there walking past me in the hallways, stealing glances, in class, and even lingering in places I used to go alone. It was suffocating. But what frustrated me the most was how unbothered he seemed. I was drowning in memories of our past life, struggling with the weight of 60 years of pain, but Juan didn't feel any of it. He had no idea what he had done to me, no idea of the nights I spent waiting for him to come home, no idea of the sacrifices I made just to get a sliver of his attention. He was free, I wasn't, and yet he kept looking at me like I was someone important. Why? Why was he so curious about me? Why was he trying to talk to me when he had spent 60 years ignoring me? It wasn't fair. One day, as I rushed toward the library to clear my head, I heard hurried footsteps behind me. I knew who it was before. I even turned around. Anita, Juan called. His voice was smooth, confident just like before. I kept walking. He caught up to me. Why do you keep avoiding me? I clenched my fists, my nails digging into my palms. Because I know who you are, Juan, and I know what you'll do to me. But I couldn't say that, so I stopped, turned to him, and forced my voice to stay calm. I'm not avoiding you. I just don't want to talk to you. His brows furrowed slightly. Why not? I scoffed, shaking my head. Do I need a reason? Juan stared at me, something unreadable in his expression. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled and stepped back. Fine. He walked away without another word. I should have felt relieved. I had finally pushed him away. But then why did my chest feel so tight? For days, I avoided Juan completely. I sat on the opposite side of the classroom, changed my usual routes through the school, and even skipped lunch just to avoid running into him. But he was everywhere. Even when I didn't see him, I felt his presence, and worst of all, I started noticing things. The way his fingers drummed against the desk whenever he was thinking. The way he tapped his pen when he was impatient. The way his jaw tightened slightly when he was annoyed. These were things I shouldn't be noticing, because I had seen them before. For 60 years. I still remembered the way he used to rub his temples after a long day at work. The way he used to stare blankly at his coffee cup in the mornings, lost in thought. The way he barely looked at me when we were together, as if I was just a piece of furniture in his life. Now, suddenly, he wanted to pay attention. No, I wouldn't let myself fall into this again. But my resolve wavered when I saw something I never expected. One afternoon, I walked past the school courtyard and froze. Juan was standing there, arguing with his father. I hadn't seen this man in years, but I recognized him instantly. Mr. Carter, a powerful, ruthless businessman. The man who controlled Juan's life just as much as my father controlled mine. I ducked behind a pillar, listening. You know what's expected of you, Mr. Carter said coldly. Juan's jaw clenched. I never agreed to this. You don't have to agree. You will do what's best for the family. The engagement has already been discussed. My breath caught. The engagement, this was how it started. In my past life, our parents had arranged our marriage without even asking what we wanted. I never knew how Juan felt about it. He never told me, but now, I saw it clearly. Juan hated it. I don't care about the engagement, Juan said, voice low. I'll decide who I marry, not you. Mr. Carter's eyes darkened. You don't have a choice. I felt a chill run down my spine. I knew what would happen next. Juan would give in, just like I had Dot, because in the end, neither of us ever had a choice that night. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing. I always thought Juan had wanted our marriage, that he had never cared because he had chosen that life. But if what I saw today was the truth, had he been trapped too? I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to push the thought away. It doesn't change anything, even if Juan was forced into our marriage. It didn't erase everything he did to me. It didn't erase the way he ignored me, the way he made me feel invisible. I refused to feel sorry for him, and yet, I kept hearing his voice in my head. I'll decide who I marry, not you. For the first time since I was reborn, I wasn't sure what to think. The next morning, I walked into class and stopped in my tracks. Juan was already sitting at his desk, staring out the window. But something was different. His usual smirk was gone. His confident posture was stiff. His hands were clenched into fists on the desk. I swallowed hard. Why did I feel like I had seen this before? And then I remembered. The night after our wedding, he had been sitting in his office, staring at the wall, his hands curled into fists, just like this. I had stood at the door, too afraid to ask if he was okay. I never asked. I never knew what he was thinking that night. And now, looking at him, I realized something terrifying. Even after 60 years, even after being reborn, I still didn't understand Juan Carter. I thought I had Juan figured out, that he was the same selfish, arrogant man from my past life, that he would never change. I was wrong. One evening, I received a call from my father. His voice was firm, leaving no room for argument. The Carters are hosting a dinner this weekend. You will attend. I gritted my teeth. I already told you I'm not marrying Juan. You don't have a choice, Anita. The line went dead. I clenched the phone in my hand, my heart pounding. Why was this happening again? Even after being reborn, nothing had changed. That weekend, I found myself seated at a long dining table in the Carter estate. The air was thick with tension. Juan sat across from me, silent, his expression unreadable. His parents smiled, discussing the engagement like it was already decided. My father nodded along, talking business, ignoring me entirely. I hated this, but when I looked at Juan, I noticed something strange. He wasn't smirking. He wasn't arrogant. He was tense. His fists were clenched under the table. I narrowed my eyes. Was he just playing along, or was he just as trapped as I was? Then, his father spoke. The wedding should happen before the end of the year, I snapped. Slammed my fork onto the plate. I never agreed to this. The entire room fell silent. Juan's father looked at me sharply. Excuse me, I pushed my chair back, standing up. I don't want to marry Juan, and I won't. My father's expression darkened. Sit down, Anita. I refused to let them decide my life again. But before I could storm out, Juan stood up too. And then, he did something I never expected. I won't marry Anita either. The entire table froze. His father's face hardened. Juan, no, Juan interrupted. His voice sharp. You can force us into this dinner, but you can't force me into a marriage I don't want. I stared at him, completely stunned. Was this real? Was he really fighting back? Juan turned to me. Our eyes met. And in that moment, I knew he meant it. He was defying his family for the first time, and he was doing it for me. I didn't know what to feel, but I knew one thing. This wasn't the one I remembered. This was someone new. Juan and I had drawn the line. We both stood up against our families, refusing to accept a future that had already been written for us. But I should have known it wouldn't end that easily. The very next day, at school, I found out just how far they were willing to go. As I entered the classroom, whispers spread like wildfire. My classmates shot glances at me, their eyes filled with curiosity and pity. I frowned, trying to understand what was going on. Then I saw Juan. He was sitting at his desk, completely still, his jaw clenched. His usual smirk was gone. I hesitated before walking over. Juan, what's going on? He looked up at me, his eyes dark and filled with something I couldn't quite place. You haven't seen it yet. Seen what? He reached into his bag and pulled out his phone, holding it up for me to see. I froze. On the screen was a photo of me and Juan at the dinner last night. It had been edited to make it look like we were holding hands, smiling like a happy couple. The caption underneath read, "The perfect match. Juan and Anita's engagement officially confirmed." I snatched the phone from his hand, my heart racing. What the hell is this? It's everywhere. His voice was calm, but his grip on the desk was tight. Our families leaked it to the media. They're making it look like we agreed to the engagement. I felt like the air had been sucked from my lungs. They tricked us. Juan exhaled sharply. They didn't trick us. They're forcing us. This is their way of telling us that, no matter what we say, it doesn't matter. I clenched my fists, rage bubbling inside me. After everything, after standing up for ourselves, they still didn't care. I should have expected this. My father always got what he wanted. The Carters were just as powerful. But what I didn't expect was what Juan did next. He stood up, grabbing his bag. "Come with me." I blinked. "Where are we going?" "To end this." 20 minutes later, we were outside his father's office. Juan pushed open the doors without hesitation, his steps firm, his presence unshaken. I followed behind, my pulse racing. Mr. Carter sat behind his large desk, flipping through a newspaper. When he saw us, he barely looked surprised. "I expected you to come," he said. Placing the paper down, his eyes landed on Juan. "You made quite the mess last night." Juan didn't flinch. "You went behind our backs." His father leaned back in his chair. "I did what was necessary." I stepped forward, unable to contain my anger. "You lied to the media. You made it seem like we agreed." He looked at me, his expression indifferent. "And it doesn't change the outcome." I felt sick. These people had no conscience, but Juan wasn't done. "I'm not marrying Anita." His voice was cold, firm. "I don't care what deal you've made with her family. I'm done being your pawn." His father studied him for a long moment. Then, with a slow smirk, he said, "Oh Juan, you still don't understand how this works." Something about his tone sent a chill down my spine. Juan narrowed his eyes. "What the hell is that supposed to mean?" His father turned his gaze toward me. "Anita, I'm sure you know your family's financial situation." My blood ran cold. "I'm aware," I said cautiously. He nodded. "Then you know they depend on this arrangement. Without it, your father's business will collapse." Swallowed hard. I knew my father had been struggling, but I never thought. Mr. Carter continued. "And Juan, your little rebellion, it's amusing. But do you think I haven't prepared for this?" Juan's hands curled into fists. "What did you do?" His father smirked. "I made sure that, if you refuse this marriage, you'll regret it." The room was suffocating. Then he pulled out a file. He tossed it onto the desk, and Juan snatched it up. As he flipped through the pages, his entire body went rigid. I moved closer to see what it was. It was a contract, a legally binding agreement that tied Juan's inheritance to our engagement. If he refused to marry me, he lost everything. I stared. In horror. "You would do this to your own son." Mr. Carter's smirk didn't waver. "One needs to understand responsibility." Juan was breathing heavily, his eyes scanning the document over and over, as if searching for a loophole. His entire life, everything he had worked for, was at stake. And then, he did something that shocked me. He ripped the contract in half. Mr. Carter's smirk vanished. Juan threw the torn papers onto the floor. His voice was deadly calm when he spoke. "You can take your inheritance and burn it." Silence. For the first time, his father looked genuinely surprised. Juan stepped forward, his hands pressed against the desk as he glared at the man who had controlled his life for so long. "I've spent my entire life doing what you wanted. I've played the perfect son. I've followed your damn rules." He exhaled sharply. "Not anymore." I watched, completely stunned. This wasn't the one I knew. In my past life, Juan had never defied his father. He had always done what was expected of him. But now he was choosing himself. He turned to me, his expression unreadable. "Anita," I swallowed. "What?" His jaw tightened, and then he said, The one thing I never expected. Run away with me. I felt my heart stop. What? Leave all of this behind. His voice was steady, but his eyes burned with something fierce. Your father, my father. End it. We don't owe them anything. I couldn't breathe. This was everything I had wished for in my past life. I had spent 60 years trapped, suffocating in a life I didn't want, and now Juan was offering me a way out. But could I trust him? The boy who had ignored me for 60 years was now asking me to escape with him. I looked into his eyes, searching for a lie. But for the first time there wasn't one. He meant it one. The man who had once been my prison was now my only way out, and I had to decide, do I run with him, or do I walk away forever? One stood in front of me, waiting for my answer. Run away with me. His words echoed in my head, louder than anything else in the room. I had spent my past life trapped. My decisions had never been my own. My happiness had never mattered. And Juan had been a part of that, but now, for the first time, he was fighting against it too. Could I trust him? Was this just another mistake waiting to happen? I took a deep breath, my hands trembling, and then I made my choice. Turned to his father. You can control the media. You can control our families, but you can't control us. Juan's father's smirk returned, as if I had just proven his point. You think you have a choice, Anita? Juan stepped closer to me, his voice firm. She does, and so do I. He grabbed my hand, and we walked out. The next 24 hours were a blur. I had never run away from anything before, but the moment we left that office, there was no going back. Juan booked a last-minute train ticket out of the city. He didn't hesitate, didn't ask me twice. He simply looked at me and said, "Are you ready?" And I was. Because this time, I was choosing my own life. We sat in silence as the train moved forward, the city slowly disappearing behind us. I felt lightheaded, like I was floating. For the first time in 2 lifetimes, I was free. But as I looked at Juan, I couldn't shake. The questions in my head. What did this mean? What did we mean? Why are you doing this? I finally asked. He exhaled, leaning back against the seat. Because I don't want to be like them. I frowned. Like who? My father, your father, all of them. His gaze darkened. Spent my past life listening to them, following orders. And you know what? It got me nothing. I stiffened. Nothing. His voice dropped. I had everything. Anita, money, power, a family name. But I lost the one thing that actually mattered. My throat tightened. What? Juan's eyes met mine. You. The train was moving, but my world had stopped. I stared at him, my heart hammering against my ribs. You never loved me. That's not true. His voice was quiet, but his words carried weight. I was a coward. I didn't know how to love you. I shook my head, trying to block out the memories. You ignored me, Juan. You spent 60 years treating me like I didn't exist. He swallowed hard, and I regret every second of it. Silence filled the space between us. The pain of the past wasn't something I could erase. It wasn't something I could just forget. But at the same time, he was here. He had thrown away everything, his inheritance, his father's approval, his entire life, for this moment. For me? I don't know if I can trust you, I whispered. Juan nodded, his gaze unwavering. Then don't. I blinked. He leaned forward slightly. Don't trust me. Watch me. I hesitated. What do you mean? Let me prove it to you. His voice was steady. Let me prove that this time, I'm choosing you. A lump formed in my throat. I wanted to believe him, but belief wasn't enough. I needed proof. So I did the only thing I could. I nodded. Juan exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath. And then, slowly, he smiled. Not the cocky smirk I remembered. Not the forced politeness from our past life. Just a real, genuine smile. And for the first time, I thought, maybe, just maybe this was a future worth fighting for. 3 months passed. I had built a new life for myself, one without my father's control. I had taken up a job at a small bookstore, finally experiencing what it was like to make my own decisions, to have my own freedom. Juan had started over too. He worked odd jobs, nothing like the powerful businessman he was supposed to become. And he had kept his word. He didn't push, he didn't try to force me into anything, he just stayed. Every morning he would meet me at the cafe across the street from my job. He would sit across from me, drinking terrible coffee, watching me with that same patient expression. He never rushed me, never demanded an answer, he simply waited, and every day I felt my walls crack just a little more. One evening, after my shift, I walked outside to find him leaning against the street lamp, hands in his pockets. He looked up, eyes soft. "Hey." Crossed my arms. "You know, you don't have to wait for me every day." "I know," he shrugged, "but I want to." I sighed, shaking my head. "You're impossible." "Yeah," he agreed. "But you like that about me." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't help the small smile that tugged at my lips. One noticed, and then he asked, "Can I walk you home?" I hesitated, then I nodded. He fell into step beside me, our footsteps soft against the pavement. For a long time, we walked in comfortable silence. Then, he spoke. "I was serious, Anita." His voice was quiet. "About proving it to you." I stopped walking. He turned to face me, waiting. I stared at him, searching for any hint of insincerity. But all I saw was truth. And for the first time, I believed it. I took a deep breath, and then I reached for his hand, his fingers curled around mine, warm, steady, and just like that I chose him. Not because of our past, not because of fate, but because in this life, he was worth the chance, and maybe so was I.